Small-minded people have small souls, my grandmother Liza used to say. So dream big, or you'll turn into a fly when you die. Then you'll live in the house of flies, forever buzzing around with the other small-minded people. Her Finnish upbringing made her honest, stern, and always on my side. She pushed me to realize my dreams, to speak my mind, and to always stay true to myself. But most of all, she made me fear the house of flies. The same way people would say, go to hell, Liza would say, go home to your house of flies. The saying just doesn't have the same cadence in English, and it isn't as powerful when it isn't coming from an angry old Finnish woman. Then again, I don't think I ever heard anyone else say it quite like her. As a kid, I used to have nightmares about the house of flies. Liza built an entire world with her stories. She told me how all the flies swarmed together in a black cloud, looking for something to make them human again. There were old rooms with bookshelves full of half-written books, a kitchen where wasted food rotted away, and a warm cellar where bodies would go to spoil and cool. There were other rooms mentioned in passing, but there were too many to keep track of. Looking back on it, it was just a made-up spook story to scare me into becoming a proud and outspoken little boy. If my teachers had known where my rash attitude came from, they'd curse my grandmother in their prayers. But there comes a point where all little boys stop hearing how great they are, a point where their dreams and ambitions start to feel far-fetched. The point where they realize they can't all be astronauts, millionaires, and hockey pros. To me, that came in my late teens, just after my grandmother died. When there are no voices left to counterbalance the abuse of ordinary life, you just listen to whatever is left. I did decently in school, but I failed miserably when I tried to pursue a higher education. I tried finding a job in my hometown back in Finland, but there was nothing available. As my remaining family distanced themselves, I found myself with nothing tying me down. So I did what my grandmother would have wanted. I cursed all of it to the house of flies, and set off on my own. I moved to Sweden and got a job as a night guard at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. It was mostly a nighttime gig, but I'd work extra whenever there was a large event on campus. It wasn't that exciting, but it was steady work and there was good pay. I think the company was impressed with my can-do attitude and work ethic. At that point, I wasn't completely broken. I had some faith, both in myself and my abilities. But over the years, that confidence chipped away. Over 10 cruel years, I was faced with a string of failed relationships and a broken engagement. I failed to get a better place than a one-room apartment, and I'd seen all my colleagues move on to greater and better jobs. One guy, Jonas, won the goddamn lottery, almost €1 million. With that in mind, you might not be so fast to blame me that harshly when I admit that I eventually stopped trying. Walking those same halls night after night felt like a Sisyphean nightmare. Hour after hour of needless patrols, questioning drunk students and locking everything down. It was useless. And that work ethic I'd been so proud of started to erode. It was late September, not that long ago. Students were returning for the new semester, and I was back on my route. By now, I knew most of the custodians and faculty. Hell, I'd been on a date with a lady in the cafeteria. But this particular night, I was done. Completely, mentally done. I had no intention of making even the slightest, smallest effort. Instead, I was right here, on Reddit. I was mindlessly browsing through my recommended subreddits. I checked all my subscriptions, and now I just wanted to fill my mind with nonsense for a while. Finally, I just picked a random subreddit and started scrolling. I was on the 10th page of New when I ran across a title that stuck with me. Would you survive the house of flies? At first I thought it was a discussion about a book or a movie. The what would you do during an alien invasion kind of post. I checked the post out but got stuck on the app loading some kind of picture. I rolled my eyes when it turned out to be an ad for a dating app. Sail away. Never seen it before. But the comments caught my eye, response after response, over and over, at least 40 comments, all saying the same thing, no. As in, no, they would not survive the House of Flies. Were they all familiar with the same story? In all my life, I'd never met anyone outside my family who'd heard about it. Then, without touching the screen, I saw myself post the same thing. No. There it was. My username and everything. And it was already getting upvoted. I turned off my phone and got up. I finished the rest of my route in record time, rushing down the hallways. There was something about the post that reminded me of my grandmother and the sense of dread her stories put in me. They were so vivid I could have sworn I'd been there. I could almost picture the study with the half-written books and the disgusting, rotting kitchen. If I'd been a talented man, I could have drawn it. Painted it, made poetry out of it, something. Something a small-minded person wouldn't do. Instead, I finished my route and was back home by dawn. The last thing I remember was stepping into the bottom floor of my apartment complex. Two shadows moved in behind me. An arm forced me into a chokehold while someone pushed something into my face. As I struggled, there was a blow to my nose. My eyes teared up as I felt someone lift my legs. My body surrendered. Up until this point, even the police believed my story. There was an open investigation into my kidnapping, and they claimed to have a list of suspects, but honestly, I'm not convinced. It's been a bit too radio silent lately, and I'm starting to think they're only listening to a part of my statement. They're not looking closer at what came next, but it is no less true and no less important. I have a vague memory of a large, dark box. There were other people in there. A man was crying, and I think someone by the corner was dead. I was too tired to talk, but not too tired to listen. There were at least 4 of us, me included, and everyone were just as disoriented and scared as I was. I was naked, and I suspected the others were too. Maybe not the corpse. I could feel cold skin against my thigh. Still, my eyes couldn't focus. It was pitch black, and not a sliver of light came through. My nose had been fractured, so my eyes wouldn't stop tearing up, and I had to breathe through my mouth. There was a strange chemical smell in the air. Not quite chlorine, not quite ammonia, something in between that made my feet itch. I think I was asleep when the doors burst open. There were armed men, all with headlamps and automatic weapons. They tied my hands with a sharp plastic string that cut into my flesh, and they forced my mouth open. I had to bite down on one of those bite guards that you might wear at a dentist. The kind where you can't close your mouth. They strapped it on tight. I was the first one out. There was a brief moment of pale sunlight before I fell into a dark cellar. I landed hard on my arm, and it knocked the air out of me. Wet dirt seeped into my pores. As I wheezed for breath, there were more bodies dropping all around me. My mouth was sore from the bite guard. As the armed men got to the person in the far-off corner of the box, I heard them talk in a foreign language. They just dumped him outside and closed the doors, leaving us in the dark. I guess he really was dead. I just saw silhouettes of the other 2. A slim ray of light came through a crack in the cellar door. I could barely make out the face of a middle-aged woman. Her eyes darted back and forth, and there was a stream of blood coming from her forehead. She must have had a bad fall. I scrambled to my knees, barely finding my balance. There was a strange, rustling sound coming from the other side of the room, like a ball of rolling confetti. I tried to see it, but it was too dark. Instead, I backed away into a corner and listened. There was a man my age, just a few steps ahead of me. As the rustling approached him, it exploded with activity. Suddenly, it became clear what that rustling sound was. Flies. A swarm of flies so tightly packed it was forming a liquid-like mass. Millions of fragile wings scraping against one another, bustling with anticipation. As soon as it touched him, they swarmed. From that single ray of light, I could see his face. Thousands of flies forcing themselves into his wide-open mouth, his ears, his eyes, his nose. The entire swarm driven by a single-minded purpose to intrude. I panicked. Hearing someone choke to death on a million flies is something that will haunt me forever. I stumbled through the dark. I crashed into a shelf and broke my bite guard by accident. I spat it out, stepped on something sharp, but just kept going forward. The middle-aged woman was right behind me. I could hear the flies spreading out across the room as if to look for more victims. There was a flight of old wooden stairs. I scrambled up, feeling my stomach trying to escape through my chest. My entire body was surrendering to adrenaline, making me ice cold and burning hot at the same time. As I got to the top of the stairs, the buzzing was all-consuming. It was so loud and ever-present that I couldn't think straight. As I bit down on a fly, trying to crawl into my mouth, I remembered Grandmother Liza's words. They will do anything to become human again. I don't know how I managed to break that door. I just kept slamming against it, using my body as a battering ram. I got splinters and cuts all over my arm and shoulder, but the old wooden door at the top of the stairs gave way. As it did, the middle-aged woman caught up with me. The two of us fumbled into a dining room. It was old, probably from the early 1930s. A simple metal vase stood atop a dining table with a hand-knit tablecloth. As I heard the mass of flies ascending the stairs, I grasped the tablecloth and covered the broken door with it. "We gotta cover it up," I yelled. "Find something, anything." My jaw ached from the bite guard, but I had to block whatever was down there from coming up. It was such a bizarre sight to see that strange, naked woman still struggling to get her bite guard off. She was making this panicked, squealing noise like a wounded animal. With her hands still tied, she started going through 2 chests of drawers, looking for something to block the door with. A few flies were still getting through until I covered the keyhole with my thumb. Tiny scratches tried to get through. The buzzing wings sounded like jet engines as they tried to get into my ears. Over and over, I managed to shake them loose. She came back with an armful of damp, moth-eaten clothes. Still, we were lucky they were damp, otherwise they wouldn't have stuck to the door quite so easily. After a few panicked seconds of using everything in the room, we had managed to barricade the door, seal it to the best of our abilities, and killed most of the flies that had gotten through. I had squashed no less than 4 against my own face. We just stood there for a while, gasping for breath. As I helped her off with her mouth guard, I noticed she was freezing cold. She couldn't take her eyes off the door, and the buzzing was still there. All those little lives looking to make things right, whatever the cost. We helped each other with the plastic strips. The woman picked up an old beige summer dress from the floor. It was a bit too big for her, but it was something. I found myself an old pair of dress pants. There were a few shirts, but they were too torn to provide any kind of warmth. They were just fabric now. "You okay?" she panted. "Yeah," I nodded. "I think so." "I didn't do anything," she cried. "I shouldn't be here." No, I agreed. "We shouldn't. I don't think anyone should." There was an arched doorway leading into an adjacent room. Restless, I urged her to follow me. Before I got through the door, I had this overwhelming feeling. I knew it was on the other side of that door as soon as I laid my hand on the handle. It was a study. 18 bookshelves lined the walls, tall enough to reach the ceiling. Old wooden floorboards covered in mismatched carpets. A big cedar wood desk with a typewriter covered in notes and first drafts. I'd been there before. It was just as I remembered it, the study in the House of Flies, full of half-written, ambitionless drivel. A room where the talentless and uninspired could struggle to make a few coins on the side. It was just as I remembered it, right down to the mismatched carpets. Grandmother used to tell me the study was a place where all records were stored. Your unfulfilled life, a half page in some forgotten book. The woman pushed past me and headed for the window. I closed the door behind me and started sealing the edges and keyholes with paper from the floor. It wouldn't be perfect, but it might buy us some time. This whole house was old enough to fall apart as it was. It'd only be a matter of time before the flies found some mouse hole to follow us through. It's nothing," she said, staring out the window. "Swamp, just swamp." "The House of Flies," I muttered. "There's nothing out there." "The what?" she yelled. You know where we are? As she stomped over to me, I nodded. I think, yeah, I said. But it couldn't be, but it is. Hey! She snapped her fingers in front of my eyes. Her hands trembled. Focus. Where are we? It's hard to explain, I protested. But just... I held my hands against my head as if to keep my thoughts in. This place was impossible. It couldn't be what I thought it was, and yet I could feel my naked feet against the wooden floor. No matter if I believed in it or not, I was still there. There's a kitchen, 2 doors down, to the left. We can't go in there, I said. That's where they spawn. As my grandmother had said, the old rotten food attracted flies. That's where they came from. Whenever a small-minded soul died, that's where it would emerge as part of the swarm. I thought about what else there was. We could take our chances in the swamp, but it seemed to go on for miles. We'd probably freeze to death before the end of the day. I think there's an attic, I said. There's also the bedrooms, bathrooms, and the hallway. So what do we do? She asked. How do we get out? I have no idea. We had to check out the surrounding area. The woman looked through the windows in the study while I moved into the adjacent hallway. There were a few flies escaping from the kitchen, but they seemed disinterested in attacking me. Instead, they just lolled about, looking for moist spots on the damp wallpaper. There was nothing outside, just swamp. The only way to get to the second floor would be through the hallway on the opposite side of the house. We would have to move either through the kitchen or the dining room, and neither were an option. But it was either that or the swamp. My feet were freezing from the wet, cold air, so I knew I wouldn't make it very far. As I returned from the study, the woman was holding up a finger. I stayed quiet. There were footsteps coming from the dining room. Footsteps and a lot of buzzing. First, I thought the man I'd seen could have survived the cellar, but that couldn't be. I'd heard how the flies forced themselves into his lungs. He was dead. I waved the woman over. Our options were limited. Somehow, we would have to move through the kitchen. We stopped in the small hallway joining the 2 rooms. As I closed the door to the study, I saw the man from the cellar burst through the door. The creak from the door hinges hung in the air. His eyes were black and his mouth wide open from the bite guard. Flies were dripping from every orifice like leaky pipes, his swollen stomach moving like a sack of worms. This was it. This was how desperate the flies were to feel human. They'd wear us like a fucking suit. I almost threw up, but I was pulled back. She grabbed my face hard and stared into my eyes. "Get your shit together," she whispered. "How do we get through the kitchen?" I focused. I tried not to think about my lungs and stomach filling with something moving inside me. I wouldn't become that. "Everything there is rotten," I whispered back. "So if we're not, we'll stand out." "What does that mean?" "We have to fit in," I said, swallowing hard. "We have to stink." Grabbing a broken curtain pole from a window, we peeked into the kitchen. I can't even begin to explain the stench. There was no way we could move through there without getting sick. We had to block our eyes, ears, mouth, everything. But we also had to fit in. Using the broken curtain pole, the woman managed to drag a half-eaten salmon out of the room. Rotten fish has its place in Scandinavian cuisine, but nothing could have prepared me for that smell. It was almost physical in nature, so warm you could touch it. The thing broke apart in our hands as we started smearing it on ourselves. Finding pieces of the broken curtains, I ripped them apart. I put some into my nose, some into my mouth, and some into my ears. I just have to close my eyes and my face would be impenetrable. I offered the remaining pieces to my companion, who reluctantly agreed. We entered the kitchen, keeping our eyes shut. I could feel the flies batting against me. I couldn't feel the floorboards anymore. Instead, there was just soft meat. I could feel the texture of fish and innards slip between my toes. Something popped like bubble wrap and splashed against my legs. It irritated the skin, but I just kept my mouth and eyes shut, slowly breathing through my dew-filtered nose. It felt like an eternity wading through that hellish room. Peaks and valleys, bone poking against the sole of my shoe, warm blood dripping from the ceiling, teeth poking out of the walls as I leaned on them for balance. Something moving, joints snapping at me like a hungry mouth. Reaching the other side, my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get a grip of the door handle. As my companion caught up with me, she pushed me away, ripped the door open, and collapsed into the hallway on the other side, dry heaving onto the floor. I closed the door behind us and took a breath of fresh air. I leaned against the wall and sunk to the floor next to her. We'd literally been knee-deep in gore. "Now what?" she spat. "There are stairs," I said. "There are lots of rooms upstairs." "So what?" she groaned. "How do we get out?" "There has to be something. Maybe we can see a way out. Maybe there's something we can use." "A lot of maybes," she said. "I thought you knew this place." "Not all of it," I admitted. "But we gotta try." "Sure. Let's fucking try." The stairs weren't far off. While the house itself was severely water damaged, the stairs were probably the worst. Some planks were so soft I thought I'd step through them. If you stuck close to the wall and grabbed the railing, you could slowly make your way upstairs. But halfway up, my companion broke through the stairs. She managed to catch herself by the railing as I reached out. Less than a second later, I could see the fly-filled man round the corner. By now, there were no eyes left, only flies. A dark mass. We gotta... I started, but couldn't get the words out. I pulled my companion up next to me as the fly-filled man stared at us. My mind went into some kind of lockdown, and I found my thoughts looping on repeat. "This won't happen to you, this won't happen to you, this won't happen to you." It was a loud crash that finally snapped me out of it, as my companion was holding onto the railing and purposefully breaking the staircase. It was so soft, her foot went straight through. "Come on," she demanded. "Stomp!" So I stomped, frantically. As the fly-filled man started making his way up the stairs, the bottom half of the staircase collapsed. He fell forward, flies spilling from his face as he hit the ground. The pallor of his hijacked body shone in contrast with the wet, dark planks below. My companion stared at him as he got up, while I backed away. "Leave us alone," she demanded. "Just fuck off, go!" The two just stared at one another. I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. "You hear me?" I said. Suddenly, he spat at her. One big, black glob of flies. It hit her face hard, and she almost lost her balance. This time, when I grabbed her, I didn't let her pull away. As we forced ourselves up to the top floor, it was clear that she was getting worse, fast. She was coughing up maggots, constantly scratching her eyes. They seemed to bulge, and she started having trouble blinking. She leaned on me as we explored the upstairs rooms. Just bedrooms, bathrooms, and a pull-down set of stairs for the attic. As I pulled them down, she put her hand on my shoulder. "Please," she sighed, her mouth starting to bloat. "Please, no." She shook her head. "No, go." She pushed me ahead and stayed back. The message was clear. I stepped up into the attic alone. It was empty. A hole in the ceiling let a single ray of light in, but the rest of the floor was just empty. A pair of well-kept curtains were hung against a round window at the end of the room, but that was it. Downstairs, I could hear her gradually degrade. The crying and screaming eventually stopped, only to be replaced by buzzing. I could hear the flies seeping through the floor. I had to do something, or I'd be next. There was nothing outside, just more swamp. I tried to swallow that sense of dread, but it just got worse. I summoned what little courage I had left. I ripped down the curtains. I tied a makeshift bag over my head so I wouldn't accidentally get any flies in my face if I dozed off. I hid in the corner of the room where I could feel water drip from a hole in the ceiling. And thus began the 4 longest days of my life. I stayed in that attic, surrounded by a swarm of flies. I managed to get drops of water from that hole in the ceiling, but that was it. I could hear my former companion and the fly-filled man stomp around downstairs together, looking for a way to get to me. Luckily, they weren't that smart. Figures, as the fly-filled man didn't even attempt to open the door to the study. He just busted it down. It's hard to describe what that kind of threat and isolation does to you. You're so trapped in your mind that you stop hearing the buzzing and you start to convince yourself it isn't real. You make up vivid images of where you really are in your mind, and you start imagining the drops of water tasting different. The hunger went from a nuisance to a pain. By the fourth day, I was shaking like a leaf. The attic was pretty warm, and I had some scraps of textiles wrapped around me like a blanket. Still, I was freezing, starving, and dehydrated. And that was only my body. I thought I imagined a car. I could hear an engine. I forced my body to stand as I listened again. There was something out there. Sounds I didn't imagine. There were fewer flies now, so I peeked through my curtain bag. It was so bright my eyes burned, but I saw them. A large white van, and there were masked men forcing people into the cellar. And outside in the swamp, a thick fog. That was new. The masked men dumped 4 people down there. One of them struggled and got shot in the leg. The sound was so loud, so distinct, that it must have been real. I've never heard that kind of gun before. They started screaming as the cellar door closed behind them. As the armed men got back in the van and drove away, I noticed something. There had been a dead person in our van, and that corpse was lying out in the swamp. The van had almost run over it, causing it to move a little in the moist grass. How hadn't I thought of that? The corpse was fully clothed, shoes and all. That might give me some time, were I to make a run for it. Taking off my makeshift bag, I stumbled down the stairs of the attic. I brushed away the flies and just ran from the slapping feet of my former companion, coming to claim my life. I had to stop thinking. I had to ignore my instinct to scream. I just held my breath, brushed the flies out of my ears and nose, and pushed forward. I fell down the staircase, spraining my left ankle and stepping on a nail. Still, I pushed on. I hurried past the fly-filled man coming out of the study, past the kitchen, past the hallway, and out the back window. As my battered body hit the wet grass outside, I gasped for air. There was a buzzing sound, but it wasn't flies. Just a few mosquitoes. Thank God. I limped forward step by step. The ground was partly frozen, and I started to lose the feeling in my toes. As I got to the corpse, I was acting on unbridled instinct. I didn't care that his shoes were too small or that I hurt my toes forcing myself into them. I didn't care that his jacket didn't go all the way around me. I just needed layers, something. But I was being followed. My former companion and the fly-filled man were coming for me out of the house. Side by side, like a couple straight out of a nightmare. Bellies extended like balloons. Their skin turned to leather. Flies crawling across their gnashed yellow teeth. They were coming for me. And with my body as bruised as it was, they were gaining on me. "Please," I coughed as I started limping away. "Please." The fog was growing thicker. They were coming closer. The buzzing around me grew stronger. The fog was so thick I couldn't see a log in front of me, and I tripped. I scraped my hand on a rock, and my sprained foot didn't let me get up without a fight. I saw the shadows of my attackers looming over me as I crawled forward inch by inch, desperately trying to get away. I imagined more shadows stepping out of the fog to join them in the upcoming feast. "Please," I kept pleading, "please." They were almost upon me. A hand grabbed my ankle, but I kicked it off. A few more pushes. That's all I had in me. Then the fog started to lighten. Looking behind me, they stopped. I'd reached the edge. I walked blindly forward for another 5 hours. As I reached a small road, I was picked up by an old man walking his dog. I was taken to a hospital, interviewed by the police, and treated for my injuries. I told them exactly what had happened, but they thought I was delirious. Being held for 4 days would do that to you. And I know what I saw and experienced. I even described the fly-filled man and my lost companion. Indeed, there was a woman who matched that description that had been reported missing, but there was no way to confirm that was her. I couldn't recognize her in the pictures. So how come I know the House of Flies? Well, I've since investigated it. My mother has a hard time believing this story, and she doesn't know what I'm even talking about, but it turns out I do have a history of disappearing. See, when I was a kid, I'd gotten lost in the woods as my parents took me mushroom picking. I'd wandered off into the fog and been gone for 2 full days. When they finally found me, I was babbling on and on about a broken house full of flies and people. I was dehydrated, hungry, and bleeding. My mother, fearing I'd suffered some kind of abuse, tried to make me forget about the whole thing. My grandmother had another idea. She figured that instead of trying to find out the horror of what really happened, she'd just indulge my incoherent nonsense. She'd make a story out of it. All of it. Just something to make me believe it was all just a made-up nightmare fairy tale. So I guess I told this story to myself in a way. Through my grandmother. The House of Flies was real all along. And this was the second time I'd survived it. Now I want you to ask yourself and think about it carefully. Would you survive the House of Flies? Today's video was supported by patrons like Mark from Earth, Crimson Muse, Joy Burton, Diane Showers, Mark Sewall, Cheryl James, Pick Your Sticker, Teddy Dog, Clue 404, Mamakato, Dante Kincaid, Zarin Ray, Angela Donovan, Larry N50, Devin Kyle, Timothy Baird, Ajeti, Bert Turner, Mijani Espinal, Michael Pierce, Big Joe, Kerry Harkonnen, LaDonna Spivey, Scott Tanaka, Tom Stewart, Sherman Davis, Bryce Shelton, Susan McClendon, Elise Batiste, Lisa and the Cult Jam, Open Circuit, Fabulavore, Raymond Jaggers, That Darn Fox, Raisin Detra, Kai Gaming 099, Windy Burns, The Wendigo, Michael Squishy Park. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content, as well as a Discord channel. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in the next Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Hope you like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. It really does help a lot. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.